What is the best argument for the Neturei Karta position?
The best argument for Neturei Karta, yeah, what is the best argument for the Neturei Karta position? So it depends what you mean. Do you mean the normal Neturei Karta position or the lunatic Neturei Karta position? Yeah, the normal has a pretty good argument. And that is, their argument is that based on the Gemara in Maseches Ksuvos, Kuf Yud Aleph, 111, there seems on its face to be a prohibition for the Jewish nation to establish a state, its own country, until the coming of the Machiach. That part of the deal of the Galut was that Galut is a divine punishment, a decree from God, and only God, through prophecy and the like, can withdraw the Gezerah of Galut. It's important to understand 2 points. Number one, Neturei Karta's argument does not depend on whether Israel is a religious state or not a religious state. The fact that it's not a religious state, or there are so many secular, even anti-religious Jews, that makes it worse. But the truth is, even if the prime minister would be the Gadol Hador, there would be the same objection of not having a state till the coming of Mashiach. The second point is that although you might assume that Neturei Karta is kind of an extreme, a marginal position, but prior to 1948, it was surprisingly widespread in the Torah world. There were quite a few Gedolim that took that position. And even a person that people often mistakenly characterize as the forerunner of modern Orthodoxy, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in the 19th century actually espoused, based on almost the same sources fundamentally, a Neturei Karta position that the Jewish people are not supposed to be a political entity until the coming of Mashiach. So it is not a frivolous argument. Again, I'm not defending it. I'm not saying it's right. And one could, in fact, agree with it ideologically and still say, once you have millions of Jews here, you've got to be concerned for their lives. And you can call that pragmatic Zionism, which can coexist with Neturei Karta philosophy. In fact, I don't want to get into too much things because I'm going to get a lot of mail on this. Chabad, if you go back to the 1920s, the Rebbe Rashab, essentially they espoused a Neturei Karta position. Chabad today are kind of Zionistic, but if you look at the transition, it basically was a pragmatic Zionism based on the fact that so many Jews are living here. It was not an ideological Zionism in and of itself. Now, when I mentioned the lunatic part of Neturei Karta, I mean the part that, they'll meet with Iran, they'll sit with Hamas, those types of things. I mean, even the Satmar Rav, who was kind of the ideological mentor of much of Neturei Karta, would never have anything to do with people who actively kill Jews. So that's more of a Meshugas type of group. But the basic ideology is not crazy. There are sources that back it up. Of course, there are also counter arguments, but that is the position. Yeah.
Can you make the case for the Hareidi hashkafa is superior to all other hashkafas?
Can I make the case? The question is, do I want to make the case? Listen. Everything needs definitions. That's the problem. What is Haredi hashkafa? Is there a single Haredi hashkafa? Now, if by Haredi you mean the primacy of Torah learning, that avodas Hashem is the most important thing, that even if avodas Hashem would mean that I sacrifice economically and I live a relatively Spartan lifestyle and I don't focus on material acquisition, yeah, a very, very good case can be made that that's exactly the basic Jewish philosophy of life, in which I don't live for money, I don't live for materialism, I don't live for careerism. I don't look at mitzvos as a sideline, meaning I'm a lawyer, but I also am an Orthodox Jew. I look at my Judaism as the essential meaning of my life. Yeah, that's 100% the way we should endeavor to live. Now, if you're talking about all sorts of other things, such as, before you go to the army, you have to let yourself get killed. It's a very, very peculiar. It's a peculiar formulation. Right? A person says, "I will not go into the army even if you kill me." because the army is too dangerous, or else you might get killed, whatever it would be. So there are many, many side issues. I'm against the state of Israel, Neturei Karta. I'm against secular studies beyond 5th grade. I'm against participating in an army, even if it's an all-religious unit. Those are also part of the Haredi world and the Haredi culture, but I'm not going to necessarily say that they are better than the alternatives. I think those are just different concerns that people have to grapple with, and the answer is not going to be a single answer for every person. So, I tell people often who have different problems with the Haredi world that in the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, there is no mitzvah, thou shalt be Haredi. That's not one of the mitzvahs per se. So what you have to look at is, I look at Hashem's mitzvos, I look at learning Torah, I look at Avas Yisrael, I look at doing chesed, and that's how I live my life. In what ideological camp you find yourself situated, doing that is frankly much, much less important than the overall commitment in that direction. Okay, so I'm not going to be an apologist for this group or that group. Yeah.
Is there any practical way of implementing all hashkafas of Judaism into one?
Yeah, is there any way to, reduce all hashkafas of Judaism?
Take all the good parts of all the hashkafas of Judaism and implement them into one?
Well, in some ways, that's actually what I was trying to even say in what I just said, and that is, I don't think you can assimilate everything because there are contradictions in certain things. But I think that as you construct your own religious life, there's a certain amount of eclecticism that you need to be engaged in, meaning to say, you take the good from one world, the good from another world, you try to create a harmony, you try to understand what works for you and your wife, your family, what may not work. And you modify things a little bit. You're not supposed to be in religious life a robot or an automaton or a cookie, a piece of cookie dough cut from a cookie cutter. You're supposed to be an individual. And as an individual, you're a thinking individual. And you're going to observe many, many different things. And some of them will be part of your religious identity. And some of them you'll decide are not part of your religious identity. And that's okay. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, one of the great Gedolim of the 20th century, said, this must have been maybe 60 years ago, that he decried what he called the Hasidification of the Litvische Torah world. What does he mean? Hasidim, to some degree, have a different tradition. They have a Rebbe, and the Rebbe kind of micromanages everything. And everything is what the Rebbe says. He says, in the Litvische world of Slobodka, Mir, Kamenetz, the yeshiva world in Europe before World War II, there was no notion that everybody had to be the same. There was a concept of diversity. There was a concept of difference. There was a concept of individuality. There was a notion that, a person made his own decisions based on the Torah that he learned. But that became lost. In other words, what happened was, in recent decades, the Litvische Torah world became like a Hasidic world almost, in which Das Torah is everything. If you look, for example, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, one of the great Gedolim of our generation, and of course he gets so many questions that he only gives these 2-word answers. He never gives a long answer. And people would ask him all sorts of things. Like they would ask him, okay, this is not, I don't know if they exact this question exactly, but they would say like, should I have Cheerios or cornflakes for breakfast? He says, what is halachically better, white chocolate or dark chocolate? And people would ask everything, every type of question. And he would often say, Kirtzo necha, which means do what you want. That was the psak. Do what you want. And the point is, people are so insecure today that the concept of making your own judgment and making your own decision has become almost extinct. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky considered that to be a failing. Because here's the thing. On one hand, Pirkei Avos does tell us, Aseh l'charav. We have to have teachers. And that's our whole life. There have to be people that we connect to. But at the same time, if your teacher has not given you the capacity to think through something and come to your own conclusions, and you're tied like an umbilical cord that you got to run back for every single thing, that is a defect in the chinuch itself. Because the same way I would not be a good parent if I didn't give my children the ability to become independent of me to some degree, the same thing is true with the Rebbe. If a Rebbe creates an atmosphere of perpetual dependence, that is a failure in the chinuch system itself. So, kind of roundabout, basically addressing your issue, and that is, I'm in favor of drawing from different ideas and putting them together. Now, I will tell you that is a little difficult in some ways because it may create confusion. In other words, one thing about sticking with one guide and one source is that life becomes much more black and white, and as a result, maybe it's easier to deal with situations because you got this precise, homogeneous response to every type of situation. So I get it. I do get it that when you have to combine different ideas, there can be confusion, there can be ambiguity, but I think, frankly, you're closer to the truth in that way. And I think ultimately it's going to give you a richer life, and I think it would be worth it for that reason.
Nowadays, when one connects like really deeply with the law of Rebbe, and where law of Rebbe are a lot more easily accessible no matter where you are in the world, how does one know who they should take as a Rebbe?
Yeah, very good question. It used to be in the olden days, you were kind of stuck. Wherever you were is where your Rebbe was because you didn't have worldwide communication and the like. Today, every person in the world can connect to every other person in the world. So I can have my Rebbe in Johannesburg or New York or Yerushalayim or London. So at that point, the question becomes, how do I know who to connect to? How do I know who to make as my Rebbe? Well, first of all, just in terms of teachers, you can learn from many teachers. That was the point we made before. But in terms of a primary Rebbe, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing, this is a very hard question. And essentially, finding the right Rebbe is analogous to finding the right wife. Meaning, like, how do you know who to marry? It's a trial and error process, right? Sometimes you start off something and thinking it'll be good, and then you see it's not the right shidduch, etc., so you go to something else. But what you're looking for in a Rebbe are a few different things. Number one, you're looking for someone who knows Torah. Obviously, if they're not knowledgeable, they're not going to be necessarily the best teacher for you. But number two, somebody who loves learning Torah, loves doing mitzvahs, has passion in avodas Hashem, and also has a love of Jewish people, ahavas Yisrael, someone who will give you the time to hear you out. Sometimes you can have the greatest gedolim, and because they're gedolim, they don't have time for you, right? Sometimes, if you had a choice of presenting your shaila to the Gadol Hador, or to a Rebbe who's not the Gadol Hador, but he knows you well and gives you the time, even though intuitively we often think, wow, if I get a chance to talk to the Gadol Hador, that'll be fantastic. Lav davka. The one who knows you and the one that gives you time might ultimately be the more valuable Rebbe for you personally. So it is a very, very subjective process. Who do I find as my Rebbe? You got to find that your neshamos resonate. You feel comfortable with the person. And where things get more difficult is that as you change, you may sometimes have to gravitate to a different Rebbe on some level as well. Not because, God forbid, there's something wrong, but, people change. You're not on the same wavelength at some point. It's interesting. I'll tell you, I was a congregational rabbi myself, and I experienced this on both sides of the equation. I experienced the phenomenon as a bacher in yeshiva, and then I experienced the phenomenon as a rabbi on the other side. Often even if people were Orthodox, they were affiliated with more modern Orthodox environment, right? And they got very close to the modern Orthodox rabbi that guided them and led them. But then they go to yeshiva, and they become, more yeshivish, more Hareidi, more frum, whatever it is, and they feel that the modern Orthodox thing, that rabbi, he compromises too much, he makes too many pesharos and the like. So a rabbi once told me, he said, the measure of his success is when his former talmidim stop talking to him. Then he knows he's successful because they've moved, to a high level. So the truth of the matter is, to my shame, to my embarrassment, I recognize that behavior in myself vis-a-vis, some rabbis that I had when I was younger, to my shame. And Mida Keneged Mida, we talked about today, as a rabbi of a shul, I experienced it from the other end, where people stopped, they got from her and whatever it is. I wasn't good enough, as it were. So Mida Keneged Mida, I accepted. It was an onesh min hashamayim because of my behavior, so it happened to me on the other end of the equation. But putting that aside, and I think no matter what, you still have to have hakaras hatov for the people that put you on the right path. This is also an issue many people have with Chabad. Many Baalei Tshuva here in Ohr Somayach. What got them to Yiddishkeit was Chabad, right? And various reasons. They may move away from Chabad, but they have to have deep hakaras hatov for Chabad putting them on the right derech. So sometimes it's a modern Orthodox versus yeshiva. Sometimes it's Chabad versus yeshiva, but it's the same type of problem. So you do sometimes have to move on, but you don't move on without the gratitude, without the hakaras hatov, without the appreciation. Even within yeshiva, I remember this, in which we had rabbeim who were our beginning rabbeim, and then we progressed to higher shiurim. So we stopped asking our beginning rabbeim questions, because now we're at the more advanced level, right? And you should know that the beginning rebbe sometimes feels hurt that talmidim are no longer interacting with them on that level. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. All I can tell you is it's a very, very subjective process, and you just have to feel that your neshama is clicking with this person. Like this is the person you want to be connected to. Yeah.
In Parshas Kisisa, Hashem offered to Moshe after the Chet HaEgel to annihilate the Jewish people and start a new nation from Moshe. How do we know Hashem didn't make that offer to someone else, or won't make that offer again?
How do we know? So the truth of the matter is, we don't. I don't know if we know it directly from the Torah, but we do know it from the prophetic books. If you look particularly in the book of Hosea and the book of Amos, you actually see this idea of the eternal covenant. Let me remind you of the book of Hosea. Hosea is one of the 12, they call minor, what an awful title. They're not minor prophets, but they're the smaller prophets. So Hosea is the first of the 12. So do you remember the funny story about Hosea? Very, very unusual story. He's a Navi. He is commanded by Hashem to marry a well-known prostitute. And Hashem commands him, so he marries this prostitute. And she keeps on plying her profession, even after she's married, whatever. And so there's a machlokus among the Meforshim. Did this actually happen? Or was this a dream, a prophetic dream that he had, that it happened? But whatever it is, whether it actually happened, or whether it's a prophetic dream, the Gemara in Pesachim is masbir. What is going on here? Why would Hashem want him to experience this? So the Gemara says that this is the backstory. That's not in the Navi itself. Hashem says to Hosea, go and give the Jewish people Musar, bring them to Tshuva, give them Tochacha. And Hosea basically says, been there, done that. They never listen anyway. Hachlifam ba'uma acheres. Exchange them for another nation. Get somebody better. So he wanted Hosea to experience the idea of loving someone very deeply who continues to be unfaithful. Marry a prostitute. And Hosea became very emotionally connected to her. And God said, why don't you divorce her? And he said, I love her too much. So Hashem says, now you understand what I'm going through. And what we say every day when we put on our tefillin is the conclusion of that Hosea segment. Ve'irastech li li'olam. Hashem is speaking about us. I betroth you to me forever. Ve'irastech li b'tzedek u'v'mishpat u'v'chesed u'v'rachamim. I betroth you to me with righteousness and with justice and loving kindness and mercy. Ve'irastech li bi'amuna. I betroth you to me with faithfulness. V'yadatem es Hashem. So you will be, this is actually an emotional connection that you will know God. In other words, God is telling Hosea, there's no way. The Jewish people are like an unfaithful wife, yes. We are an unfaithful wife. And with our averas, we are committing prostitution against the Almighty all the time. And God will hold us accountable. This is a tough love. There are going to be punishments. There are going to be different things. But the relationship will never be severed. So I would say that the two Nevi'im where the point is made most explicitly are in Hosea, Amos, many passages in Yeshayahu, and in Yirmiyahu. The phrase that we say at Ma'ariv, Avas Olam, a love of eternity, is taken from the Navi Yirmiyahu. So that's where we get the idea that God will not change the covenant. Now, I mean, as you know, I mean, what is the fundamental theological claim of Christianity? Putting aside Jesus as a person, whatever he was. The essential claim was that because the Jewish people have abrogated, they violated God's covenant, God replaced them and made a covenant with what Christians actually call the New Israel, or at least Catholics. The New Israel. The New Israel is one of the names for the Catholic Church. That's the idea of Old Testament, New Testament. Islam makes the same claim in terms of that this was a new revelation that supersedes the Mosaic revelation because the people are no longer deserving. So our argument is, and of course, let me point out that the Catholic Church pointed to this repeatedly, and that's why Jews are persecuted. That's why Jews are exiled. That's why Jews are punished, because God has rejected them. And that is why, when the State of Israel was established in 1948, the Catholic Church had an enormously difficult theological problem with Israel because it shouldn't have happened. God rejected the Jewish people. How could he, give them a state? The idea was that they're eternally damned unless they embrace Christianity. But our answer to that is, or our belief system is, that Hashem does punish us because he wants us to do tshuva. Things will happen. But the relationship that we are Hashem's nation can never be changed under any circumstances. And this is largely based on the Nevi'im that I mentioned. Yeah.
How is it possible that we could be chaved to a huge person's shot if they were like insanely great? If you're an 18-year-old guy, how could you be chaved to Rav Chaim's shot?
Oh, how could you be mechaven?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Interesting question, right? One of the greatest compliments a yeshiva bacher has is that he asks his Rebbe a kasha in the middle of shir, and the Rebbe says, "Oh, that's Rav Chaim's kasha," or "That's Tosas's kasha," going back, etc. It's interesting. Although Tosas is a Rishon and is actually greater than Rav Chaim, for some reason, I think you get more excited if you're mechaven to Rav Chaim's kasha than to Tosas's kasha and the like. And we say, Baruch Shekivanti, Baruch Hashem, I was mechabein, right? I was mechabein to Rav Chaim, I was mechabein to Tosfos, I was mechabein to the Marsha, whatever it would be. So I'll tell you how that works. So the question you're asking is, well, they're so much greater than we'll ever be, so how could I possibly come up with what they thought of? So there actually is a Maisa from Rav Yosef Karo, and I've said this Maisa before. Now, Rav Yosef Karo lived in the 1500s. He was the Rav of Tzfat, and he had a very interesting chavrusa. One of his chavrusas was an angel, a malach. He learned with a malach, and he actually wrote down in a diary his shagla v'tarya with the malach. You can actually get the sefer. It's called Magid Meisharim. It's available. So in the Magid Meisharim, he gives the following story. And I don't remember all the details, so I'm giving you the approximate version of the story. That once there was a very difficult sugya in the Gemara that he was learning, and he didn't understand it, and finally he had a breakthrough, and Baruch Hashem, everything is clear. He's very happy. It took him 2 weeks. The greatest of the Gainim. He's walking in the street, and he hears in Tzfat, right? You've been to Tzfat, the alleyway. And he overhears a shoemaker learning with his 7-year-old son that same Gemara. And the kid asks his father the same kasha that bothered Rav Yosef Karo. And the father is impatient at the son. The father said, oh, I knew you weren't smart enough to understand this Gemara. Your question is so foolish. This is Rav Yosef Karo's question. He says, the pshat is this and this and that, like it was nothing. So Rav Yosef Karo was heartbroken because he figured if this is so obvious that a 7-year-old should have been expected to know it, and I didn't know it for 2 weeks, there must be some aveira that I have that prevented me from understanding it. What was the aveira? He asked the malach. He had someone to ask. What do I have to do tshuva? So the malach told him it's exactly the opposite. Your understanding was very deep, and the world was not ready for it. But when you brought it into the world by your effort, it then became available for everybody. Now, rationally, that doesn't make sense. Rav Yosef Karo didn't teach anybody this. He didn't explain it. What do you mean he brought it into the world? If he would have written it, if he would have taught it, if he would have explained it, okay. So even Einstein's theory of relativity can be explained on some level to people who are not so genius and the like. But Rav Yosef Karo didn't do anything. But you see that the way of Torah is that Torah is a spiritual essence. Once it's in the world, you can get it too. So that's exactly how being mechabein works. Yeah, of course we're not Rav Chaim. Rav Chaim worked and worked and worked, combined with his phenomenal brilliance. He brought this idea into the world. Once it's in the world, you could get it, I could get it. It becomes spiritually accessible, like that story. That's how being mechabein works. Yeah.
Where does the minhag of learning Pirkei Avos from Pesach to Shavuot come from, and what relation does that have to the Omer?
Yeah. So this is a minhag, a very, very widely practiced minhag in Klal Yisrael. Actually, it comes in 2 versions. That Pirkei Avos, which is 5 chapters of Mishnah, and the 6th chapter is a brisa, but it's added to Pirkei Avos, that people learn on the Shabbosos between Pesach and Shavuos. And then there's a supplementary minhag. Some people continue Pirkei Avos throughout the summer and keep on going over it again and again until Rosh Hashanah. So there's the short minhag of Pesach to Shavuos, and then there's a longer minhag where you do Pirkei Avos 2 or 3 more times. At least the original minhag is an old minhag. It's already from the Gaonim. Many Rishonim bring the minhag. And the idea is that as we prepare for Matan Torah, we have to work on our midos, tovos, our character traits, our beidadam l'chavero, and therefore Pirkei Avos which talks about the midos of a person, are the best preparation for Matan Torah. And I should add that the 6th perek, the last perek, is all about learning Torah. So it was seen to be a very ideal hachana for Matan Torah. And it is a minhag that's recorded in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. So it's not stam a little bit of a chumrah. It's something that has a real source. In fact, Ohr Somayach used to have a minhag. I kind of dropped out. When Rav Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, was alive, that literally after Shabbos Mincha, every Mincha after Shabbos during between Pesach and Shavuos, people would literally sit and recite the chapter of Pirkei Avos out loud, like you'd be saying Ashrei. It's almost like part of davening. You'd sit, you'd read. I'm not sure how many people understood everything, but it was mamash like a thing of reading the parak of Pirkei Avos after Shabbos Mincha. The minhag got discontinued for some reason, but I remember that. Yeah.
How does an Ashkenazi know when he can follow a Sefardi Halachah or a Sefardi specifically in something for Sephardi, as you know, you can use an Ashkenazi halacha. So, for example, if an Ashkenazi is reading Chazon Avadia, how does he know when he can follow this halacha, or if the Sephardi is reading Ohr Somayach, how does he know when he can follow it?
Yeah, so the question becomes, we have Sephardim, we have Ashkenazim, and we have Sifrei Halachah that are Sephardic. Sifrei Halachah, let's say Chazon Ovadia, and then we have Ashkenazic Sfarim, Ohr Somayach, whatever it would be. So how does a Sephardi know that he could follow something in Rav Moshe? And how does a Sephardi, how does an Ashkenazi know he could follow something in Chazon Ovadia? I can't give you a simple answer to that. In other words, the point that you're making is a good point, and that is, just because something is a ruling by a Sephardi rabbi does not make it the minhag of Sephardim. Meaning, sometimes halacha is generic, meaning sometimes halacha are rules that just apply across the board. So, for example, if I read in Chazon Ovadia, it's a mitzvah to make kiddush over wine, Rav Ovadia is not saying that as a Sephardi. He's just saying that as a rabbi, meaning the same rule applies to Ashkenazim. So your question is, how do you know when something is Sephardi specific, and how do you know when it's a general principle of halacha that can apply across the board? The short answer is I can't give you an automatic answer to that. One of the things to check are the footnotes. Because you might find that the footnote will refer to both Ashkenazi and Sephardi sources. When it does that, it's a general halacha that you can apply. If you notice that the halacha only has Sephardic references or only Ashkenazic references, so that would maybe put you on notice that it may be something specific. But the truth is you can't really know until you learn the sugya. You do the Gemara, it's a long process. You do the Gemara, you do the Rishonim, you look at the halachas, and then you determine, is this an Ashkenazi Sephardi issue, or is this, just a general psak? But, I can't give you a magic answer to know that ahead of time. Yeah. I'm sorry, do you have a follow-up? Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that someone you told me, is that as long as Rabbi Yosef or Sephardi person doesn't argue with the Mishnah Berurah, it's okay for an Ashkenazi to follow that. So I guess the follow-up question would be, the Mishnah Berurah rules that paper is mukta machmas chasron kis, and Rabbi Yosef makes the case in Chazon Ovadia that today the mitzvus has changed because since paper is so nafutz. So would it be what would be the status of this for paper for Ashkenazi?
I would say that would actually be an example where you could use the Sephardi psak, because the Sephardi psak is not cholek on the Ashkenazi psak. It's simply making an observation that the Ashkenazi psak was based on a certain time and place, and the situation has changed. So that badafka, I would look at that as a much more general type of psak halacha that an Ashkenazi could be somechan, because he's not arguing, he's just qualifying and saying that the given psak does not apply under those circumstances. Yeah.
So we know that the written Torah is not complete without the oral Torah, right? But what if we ask the other way around? If the oral Torah is essentially the entire Torah, then why is the written Torah needed? For example, in this week's the written Torah repeats the manual of Shabbat. Repeats it. purpose was building the tabernacle. And the commentary explains that the sages derived from this. The 39 malachot used to build the tabernacle are the forbidden malachot of Shabbat. But wait, if Moshe learned the Oral Torah directly from Hashem on how to keep Shabbat, which the Jews needed to start keeping during Moshe's time, and the oral law was passed down, then what did the sages need the pasuk for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You're kind of reversing it, right? Everyone always asks why we need the oral law. You're asking why do we need the written law? Meaning, given the fact that God transmitted to Moshe the meaning of all of the commandments, so why bichlal have any type of written text? Just absorb everything into the oral law. That's actually a very, very interesting question. I'm not sure if I have a definitive answer, but I think that one of the things Hashem wanted to show us was that if you take a written text, and in that written text you can derive and you can see all of the many, many different rules of the oral law, then that is kind of a proof for divinity that you wouldn't have if the Torah would only be oral. Meaning if the Torah would simply be oral, so I could theoretically say, oh, the sages, made it up, and they then passed it down from generation to generation. But when you have a written text that is so wondrous that all of these oral laws can be derived from the encoding and from the Gezerah Shabbos and the Yud Gimel Midos, that kind of gives you a stamp of authenticity that this is a divine document. Especially when you think about the Bible codes. I'm not necessarily a devotee of the Bible code's methodology, but the idea that in the written text is encoded all the future events that will ever happen. So I would suggest that the tachlis of the written Torah is to kind of give us a sense that this is divine, which I might not have had I had the oral Torah without the written Torah. Yeah.
In yeshiva, there's a sort of, when both in the yeshiva, some guys are doing better than them, some guys are doing worse than them, some guys are stronger and learning stronger leaders, stronger at different things. And it may be difficult for a bacher to see certain friends excel in certain areas that he may not be excelling in. So what are certain methods to bacher to be able to keep a sense of self-security and integrity and self-esteem that I am where I am and they are where they are and it's okay?
Yeah, these are very, very hard, difficult questions. I wouldn't necessarily call them philosophically difficult, but they are emotionally difficult. In which, in fact, there's a Journey song. I don't know if you heard the Jewish music Journey's beautiful stuff about two guys. I think my friend Sammy. It's a song about two guys who grew up together and they played baseball, and they were inseparable. And then they went to yeshiva, and one guy became like a regular guy, and the other guy became eventually a Rosh Yeshiva, a Gadol. And there was something very, very nostalgic and sad in the sense that they were so together and they grew separately in different ways. But the thing you have to recognize, we go back to, I've spoken about this, go back to Machtas HaShekel, right? The Torah says that in the Beis HaMikdash, you give a half shekel every year. And it says the rich guy does not give more, and the poor guy does not give less. Everybody gives Machzis HaShekel. And the Sfas Emes asks, I understand why the poor guy cannot give less. There's a minimum donation. You have to do something. But what's wrong if the rich guy wants to give more? If somebody comes to Ohr Somayach and says, I want to pay more than full tuition, we're not going to say no. I promise you we're not going to say no. So somebody comes to the Beis HaMikdash and says, I want to give 1,000 shkalim for the Beis HaMikdash. We say, no, can't, only half a shekel. So the Sfas Emes says a beautiful thing. When the Torah says rich people, poor people, it doesn't only mean in money. Rich and poor can be in many, many ways. A person could be rich in wisdom, in charisma, in leadership ability. Rich in all of the different human talents. And poor can mean deficient. And what the Torah is teaching me is, as long as each person does the best with what they have, the poor and the rich are equal in the eyes of Hashem. So, there are two ways of communicating this. One is a tougher way, one is not, and that is, listen, if you do your best in Hashem's eyes, you are a success. The tougher way is, hey, and if you're jealous because you're not doing your best, so why should I have Rahman? And I guess I look at a guy that's excelling. So there are two possibilities. Really, I could have been just as good as him, but I don't work as hard. So I'm supposed to have rachamim on you? Or, so I feel bad because I'm not as good as him. Yeah, but you're not as good as him because you don't work as hard as him. Okay, so work as hard as him, you'll be as good as him. Now, if Ali b'di'emes, you're not going to be as good as him, so then we have the softer message. You do your best. In the eyes of Hashem, you're equal. This is the interesting question. Pirkei Avos says, Izeu Asher, who is a wealthy person? Hasomayach b'chelko. He's happy with his lot. Now, there's a common pshat that many meforshim say, that Sameach b'chelkai is only in Gashmias, not in Ruchnias. When it comes to Gashmias, how much money I have, I should be happy with what I have. In Ruchnias, they say, Sameach b'chelkai? Never. You always have to want to be better and better. So that's one pshat, that Sameach b'chelkai is not shayach by Ruchnias. But on a deeper level, it actually is. Although you have to keep on striving to be better and grow, but you have to be happy with the talents that Hashem gave you and the kochos that Hashem gave you. You know, people who run marathons, and I cannot claim to have a lot of experience in this, but people who run marathons often say they are not running to compete against other people. They are running to compete against themselves. They want to best their time. Right? If they did it in 3 hours, they want to do it in 2 hours and 55 minutes, or whatever it is. So, learning is not about competing with other people. It's about doing your best. And if you do your best, you are in front of Hashem with the same chashivas. Appreciate who you are. Appreciate your kochos. Appreciate that Hashem gets nachas in what you're doing. In fact, I've mentioned this before, forgive me for repeating, the Mabit, who was the head of the Beis Din in Tzfat in the time of the Beis Yosef, says in the Hakdama to his hashkafa sefer Beis Elokim, that imagine you had two people. One guy was a real super genius. He could do 100 blot of Gemara a day. 100 blot of Gemara a day. That means you finish Shas every month. By the way, that was the Vilna Gaon. I mean, people think Vilna Gaon like finished Shas every day. No, he didn't do it every day. The Vilna Gaon finished Bavli and Yerushalmi every month. And in order to finish Bavli at least every month, you got to do 100 blot a day. So the Vilna Gaon Seder was 100 blot of Gemara a day, which he did. And by the way, it was only a small part of his day, but this was his thing, 100 blot of Gemara a day. Okay, so let's imagine you had such an Eloi who could do 100 blot of Gemara a day, and then you have another guy who struggles and he does 1 page a week. Now, what if the Eloi says, I'm so much ahead of everybody else, I'm going to do 50 blot a day, which is still phenomenal. Okay, and I'm way, way ahead. So he does 50 blot a day. So they go to Shemayim, and the guy who does 1 blot a week is going to be on a higher madrega than the guy that does 50 blot a day. Because the guy, this is the mabit, because the guy that does 50 blot a day only gives Hashem 50% of his yechelas, and the guy that does 1 blot a week is giving Hashem 100%. So not only are two people equal if they're both doing their best, but if one guy is doing his best and the other guy is not, even if the other guy is accomplishing so much more than the other person, that person who's giving Hashem his best is more chaviv, more beloved to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So teachers give lip service all the time. Oh, it's the effort that counts, the hard work that counts. But, frankly, that's lip service because it doesn't always translate in the grade. Right? You're still going to get a 50 or a 60. So we tend to dismiss that, it's a pat on the head. Oh, you worked hard, you're a nice boy. But you have to know and you have to internalize that in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's cheshbon, that is exactly the way it works. That's not just lip service. That's the metzius. That is the reality, that the only thing that matters is the effort that you put into it. And a person has to know that. And then a person also has to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu opens up the gates of wisdom to people who work. Meaning a person might think, I'm limited. So we tell them, okay, we'll work, do your best. But the point is, if you do your best, some of your limitations go away as well. You reach different levels. They say, I'm not sure if it's true, and it may not be true. Or maybe the Netziv said it about himself, and it may not be true, he was being modest. But the Netziv said on himself that he was a person of very average intelligence, and he did not really grasp things as quickly as many of his chaverim in yeshiva. But he worked, and he worked, and he worked, and he worked, and he worked. And al yedei kach, he became the very, very great Gaon that he became. So these are just things to try to internalize. I know that most guys know this already in their heads. I probably didn't say anything new at all. But as they say B'Shem Rav Nachman of Breslov, the biggest distance in the universe is between your head and your heart. You know things in your brain, but you don't yet feel it in your heart. And the hope would be that a person who could feel that in his heart, how beloved it is that he's learning Torah. Yeah.
Said in the old yeshivas in Europe, they used to do the pin test.
Yeah.
The pin would be inserted into the Gemara, and the student would recite from memory the exact letter where the pin was located in all the dakim. I think, well, the person who wrote this question thinks this test must be a myth, because surely it is prohibited to deliberately make a hole in a sefer. Can the Rav please elaborate on the pin test? If he thinks it ever really happened, and please speak about other Talmudic feats of strength from that era.
Yeah, so I know as a matter of fact that there was such a thing as the pin test because I had a 5th grade Rebbe who did I have to admit, I didn't fully understand it. I didn't know what he was trying to show me with the pin and the needle. And I was 5th grade. I didn't really chop what he was even doing. But in retrospect, he was doing the pin test. Like he would put a pin on a word. And the pin test basically it's really a question of either photographic memory or something similar to that, in which, let's say you put a pin, or your finger, you do it with your finger too, you put your finger on a word, and you're able to say what word will be on that same position on the page 10 pages later or 100 pages later, meaning you have a photographic image of the page. Ad kedei kach, that you can visualize the word that's going on. So here's the thing about you're not allowed to mutilate a sefer. Okay, you can do the pin test with your finger. It doesn't have to be with the pin, whatever it would be. But that such a test existed was surely the case. But I don't think spiritually it's that impressive of a feat, because the idea of a pin test requires what is called a photographic memory, an eidetic memory. Now, photographic memory, we use it interchangeably. When someone has a good memory, we say photographic. That's not true. Photographic memory is a very, in fact, a person doesn't even have to have a high IQ necessarily. Photographic memory is just a particular idea that literally the mind is like a camera. It takes pictures. And therefore it can take a picture of every daf in your mind. Now the truth is, when it comes to Torah Shebaal Peh, that is actually not the ikar. The ikar is not to have photographic duplications of every page in Shas. The ikar of Torah Shebaal Peh is havana, is understanding the concepts. So the pin test is a tribute to photographic memory. And that's a gift. That is a gift. It's good to have. I mean, memory is a gift, and in learning, memory is a very, very valuable gift. And As you get older and the memory gets a little weaker, you appreciate what a gift memory is. But as I say, in Torah Shabbal Peh, it is the Havana that is the most important. But yeah, people with great memories used to do the pin test. Yeah.
Between all these nations.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He had asked, the end of the question was, are there other feats of Talmudic strength that were used? For sure there was. And that is the Vilna Gaon. Listen to this. The Vilna Gaon instructed that each of his Talmidim should memorize a Maseches of Gemara by heart, so that when they're traveling and they don't have a sefer, they will be able to learn in their mind, and they could be Makayim, the pasuk in Kriya Shema, B'lechtecha v'derech, when you're walking in the road. So a certain Talmud took on Maseches Sukkah as his project, to know Maseches Sukkah totally by heart. Every daf of Maseches Sukkah. Sukkah is a hard Maseches, and it's not the easiest of Maseches. But the guy then made a bit of a mistake, I would suggest. He wanted the Vilna Gaon to give him a bechina on Maseches Sukkah. Test me! So he figured the Vilna Gaon would ask him this, the Vilna Gaon's question is a bit unusual. He says, how many machloksim of Abaye and Rava are there in Maseches Sukkah? How many times is Rav Yochanan mentioned in Maseches Sukkah? Now, even if with the pin test, and even if you had a photographic memory, you couldn't answer that instantaneously. You'd have to envision every page and then count the Rav Yochanan, etc. And then the Vilna Gaon said, how many cases of kosher sukkahs are discussed in the Maseches? And how many cases of puzzle sukkahs are discussed in the Maseches? And the Gra said, by the way, a wondrous, amazing remez that people are still trying to figure out. The word sukkah is spelled in two ways. Sometimes it's spelled malay with a vav, and sukkah b'malay, samach vav chav hey, 66, 86, and 5 is 91. Malay is 91. Sometimes sukkah is spelled without a vav. The gematria is 85. Malay is 91. Chaser is 85. Says the Vilna Gaon, in Maseches Sukkah, there are 91 cases of complete sukkahs, kosher sukkahs. And there are 85 cases of invalid sukkahs, defective sukkahs. And that's merumas in the gematria of sukkah, malay, or chaser. To this day, Talmidei Chachamim are trying to figure this out because they can't get the exact countings of the Gra and the like, and it's a bit of a puzzle that people work on. But this is the Vilna Gaon's knowledge of not just Maseches Sukkah. The Vilna Gaon is giving the guy a test in Maseches Sukkah. This is the Vilna Gaon's knowledge of every single Maseches in the Bavli Yerushalmi. Every single one. The Vilna Gaon knew it that way. So yeah, there were a lot of feats, more than the pin test. I also heard about two Gedolim. They were in a place without Svarim. So they just took turns reviewing Shas. Not word for word, but Shakivataria, starting from Brachos, right? I start with the first daf of Brachos, you do the second daf of Brachos, I do the third daf of Brachos, you do the fourth daf of Brachos. After we finish Brachos, we go to Shabbos, we go to Erevin, we go to Pesachim, we go to Shkalim. Do you imagine? Going through Shas, Shakivataria. And, people are not perfect, so every once in a while, whoever was reciting it got something wrong, and the other person corrected him, said, no, you skipped that one. It's going back. And this went on. I think the story goes they went through half of Shas in whatever it is, in 2 days or whatever it will be. So that was something that we're not used to today. We're not used to today, the total mastery of Gemara. But so the pin test was one of the things they did, but there were a lot of other things they did as well. Yeah.
Between all these nations who are diametrically opposed to, the Jews, for example, Edom, Yishmael, and the Muslims, who's viewed as like, who gets the final one in terms of right before Machiach?
Yeah. So this is interesting. So in the mainstream Chazal, the final exile is always described as the exile of Edom, Edomite exile, because that was associated with Rome, that destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, and therefore that is the four kingdoms, starting with Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. However, in later midrashim, such as Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, it tells us that there will be a fifth exile, or at least a 4.5, maybe an upgraded version of 4. That is the ascendancy of Yishmael, which is the Arab world. So it's interesting how all of this was foreseen. And Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer says that the Golus of Yishmael will be the most dangerous and the most oppressive of all of the Jewish exile, of all of the exiles that Klal Yisrael has gone through, because Yishmael has spiritual merit, the merit of circumcision, and the merit of tefillah, of prayer, and the merit of tznius. And they're the only nation besides Yisrael that have God's name in their name. Yisrael, Yishmael, Hashem's name. And that is why they are the most dangerous, because they also come with certain divine energies and divine potentials. And that's why we can only defeat them primarily by spirituality and not just by brute force. So it seems that, how do you reconcile the idea of Golus Yishmael with Golus Edom? The short answer is that it's not that the Edomite Golus is replaced by the Yishmael Golus, but rather both are going on in the same time. And that's exactly the situation. Most of the Jewish world are living in Christian country, which is connected to Edom, Rome. On the other hand, we are being victimized. The whole Western world is being victimized by Islamic fundamentalism, which is Yishmael. So in a sense, we are in the Golus that combines Esav, Edom, and Yishmael going on at the same time. Okay, so both of them are true, but Yishmael is said to be even more dangerous than Edom.
In terms of Gog and Magog and Amalek?
Yeah, so Gog and Magog, again, Gog and Magog, remember, it's not Gog versus Magog. Gog is the king of Magog, and in the book of Yechezkel and in the book of Zechariah, this is described as the wars against Yerushalayim that will culminate in the revelation of Machiach and the like, and exactly who Gog and Magog are, and the confederation of nations they're going to gather. There are many, many different opinions. In other words, it may not be Ishmael. Some connect it to the Russians. They even connect the Russian-Ukraine war to Gog and Magog. Some do connect it to Ishmael, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Some connected it to Nazi Germany, which means the Gog and Magog already happened. Some have a Messiah from the Gra, although it's not written down anywhere in the Gra's writings, that the final war of Gog and Magog will only last 12 minutes. Now, for hundreds of years, nobody understood what type of war would only be for 12 minutes. Now, unfortunately, we know very clearly what type of war could take around 12 minutes, and that's a nuclear war. And then you combine that with Iran having nuclear capacities, or possibly nuclear capacities, and we see what we might, God forbid, might be in for. So the short answer is there are so many identifications of Gog and Magog that we really cannot give anything definitive. It ranges from Russia to Persia, Iran, just like Purim, to Arab-Israeli, Ishmael, and the like, or maybe a combination of all of the above. I do want to point out, Vilna Gaon notes, he gives you good news and bad news. The bad news is he's basically predicting a nuclear holocaust. Gog and Magog will be 12 minutes. The good news is that he says that since we have a klal that all negative prophecies can be annulled by tshuva, it's not a done deal that Gog and Magog has to be this way. It can still be changed. And therefore, that's the good news, that's the hopeful news, that the Chavlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach, can be modified by tshuva and ma'asim tovim. Let me end on that question with a statement of the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim. When the Rambam discusses Gog and Magog, very, very briefly, the Rambam says we should not spend a lot of time trying to identify who Gog is, Magog is, what's the order of the battles and the like, because there's no way you're going to know it ahead of time. You will only know it in hindsight, meaning when Mashiach comes, we can then work backwards and say, now I understand this, I understand this, I understand this. You only understand it after the fact. You don't understand it as it's happening, because there are many different interpretations. And the Rambam concludes that speculating too much about Gog and Magog and the coming of Mashiach does not bring a person to Avas Hashem, to love of Hashem, or to Yiras Hashem, and therefore the Rambam suggests that we shouldn't spend too much time. You know, Christians like to do this a lot. Christians do a lot of, not that you bother checking their stuff, but they do a lot of messianic speculations. And there are certain groups of Jewish people who also like to do this as well. They engage in a lot of messianic speculations. But, I don't know. It's like, I can go back to 2010 and they say, this is the year Mashiach is coming. I mean, just go back and check all these old blogs, if they're still on there. 2010, they said, this is absolutely the year. And I'll give you all of this proof. 2011, the same thing. 2020, the same thing. So you go back, all of these predictions, prognostications. So the Rambam already told us. The Rambam writes that we shouldn't spend a lot of time in this. We believe there will be a Geula. We believe there'll be a binyan Beis HaMikdash. And we believe that before that happens, there are going to be tough times. And that's kind of as far as we go. We really can't get a more complete picture than that. Yeah.
Rebbe referenced a couple weeks back that there might be a discrepancy in the Jewish and
Yeah. 160 years, yeah.
It would have to be a multiple of 7 in terms of like Smicha. Also, what are the other opinions besides reshut?
Yeah. Just to review this very quickly, this is the most famous contradiction in Jewish historical chronology between secular history and the Kabbalah of Chazal, as recorded in the work Seder Olam. Remember, Seder Olam is a very important work. Seder Olam is from the Tanoim, and is essentially the chronology from Brias HaOlam to the Chorban Bayis Sheni. It's the chronology. And it gives you how many years different things happened and the like. Some of the information is you can get directly from Nach, but other information is from the Tanoim themselves. The Mechaber of Seder Olam was Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi was a Rebbe of Rav Yehuda Hanassi, so it's earlier than the Mishnah itself. Now, the Seder Olam chronology basically is the following: that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by the Babylonians. There were 70 years of exile, and then the second temple was built, and it lasted for 420 years, and it was then destroyed. The first Mikdash was 410, 70 years of Galus. The second Mikdash was only 420 years, which means, from how many years was there from the Chorban Bayis Rishon to the Chorban Bayis Sheni on Tisha B'Av? 490 years. Right? Because 70 plus 420, then there was the Chorban Bayis Sheni. The problem is that this presupposes that the Persian period, in other words, right, the second temple was built under Persia, and then you have Greece and Rome. This only assigns like a 50-year period to Persia. And indeed, Seder Olam says there are only 4 Persian kings. There was Koresh, Cyrus. There was before Koresh there was Daryavesh, the first, who is really from Madai, but we'll call him Persian. So Daryavesh is Persian king number 1. Koresh, Cyrus is Persian king number 2. Achashverosh is Persian king number 3. And Darius II, Daryavesh II, who is the son of Achashverosh and Esther, is king number 4. He authorized the Beis HaMikdash, and he had a long reign, but eventually he was conquered by Alexander. So there's only 4 Persian kings, and the duration of the Persian Empire over Eretz Yisrael till it was conquered by Alexander of Macedonia, of Greek, was only like 50 years. Okay, and that's the cheshbon of Seder Olam. The problem is, if you look at Josephus, even, the Persian period was much, much, much longer. Instead of 4 Persian kings, there were around 12 or 14 Persian kings. Instead of a 50-year period, it was a 200-year period. And let me just prove it with dates. Under secular historical dating, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple in the year 586 BCE. 586 BCE. Now, I don't want to go over too much math here because I lose track myself. You then have 70 years of exile. So what year was the second temple built? The second temple was built 516 BCE. Okay? Chorban, 586 BCE. Binyan, 516 BCE. When was the second temple destroyed? The year 70 of the Common Era. So how many years do you have between 516 BCE and 70 CE? Well, it's 516 plus 70. You have a period of 586 years for the second temple. Chazal only gave the second temple 420 years. Which means, according to the secular reckoning, the second temple stood 166 years longer, right? Because it was 586 years, right? Which means, and the way you get that into is the Persian period was much longer. The Persian period was much longer, and therefore you have a total duration of 586. So how do you reconcile this, right? How do you reconcile this? So the truth is, many, many books have been written on this. Many, many different answers have been suggested. Rabbi Wein, he should be well, wrote history books, and he addresses this in a footnote, and he says, this is a famous question, and he's not going to take a position on how do you reconcile that. Some say Seder Olam is wrong and secular is right. Some say, which we don't like to say, obviously, some say secular is wrong and Seder Olam is right, meaning you just dismiss the other cheshbon. Others want to reconcile them. Rav Schwab, I mentioned a few weeks ago, had a very daring hypothesis that Chazal deliberately concealed 166 years of the Second Temple, because those were times of Avodah Zarah, whatever it is, he didn't want to. Chazal didn't want to add it, which means, according to that cheshbon, this is quite amazing, quite scary. It actually means the year from creation that we are in is not 5785. It is 5785 plus 168. What year? 5951. Now, that's a little, well, maybe it's hopeful or maybe it's scary, because if we believe that Mashiach comes no later than the year 6000, we're not 200 plus years from the year 6000. We're only 50 years or so from the year 6000, based on the idea that Chazal took out of the calendar 166 years. Now, this is such a daring proposition that Rav Schwab himself, in a later article, says he hereby withdraws it, and he says he doesn't offer it as a teretz anymore, and he says, Geshem, as Chazal say, Geshem shekibalti schar al adrisha, just as I get reward for exposition, I'll get reward for keeping quiet. So Rav Schwab withdrew it as a teretz, but Lamaisa, it is a teretz that he gave, and the article that he wrote is still out there. So people discuss this. I mean, we don't have a davar borer. However, it is pointed out that instead of looking at this as a machlokas between Seder Olam and secular history, it's been pointed out that it's a machlokas within Chazal itself, meaning the were Gedolim who point out that if you look at various other makairos within Chazal, you will find a much longer period for Persia than Seder Olam gives. Okay, so it's not a question of going with secular over Chazal. The question is whether the other Chazal would override Seder Olam. But again, this is an absolutely famous question. This is the most famous contradiction in Jewish chronology. A very, very difficult period. The length of the Persian period. The reason why it's so complicated is because in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we said you have Daryavesh, right? Daryavesh the first, Koresh, Achashverosh, Daryavesh the second. That's what Seder Olam says. Problem is that throughout the book of Ezra, we keep on having some other guy who's called Artaxshasta. So Seder Olam just says that's just another name for Achashverosh or whatever it is. But others say these are other kings. These are different kings that have to be added. Even Rashi brings, there was Koresh had a son, Cambyses, that's not recorded. So it's a very, very murky sugya, very misubach. Yeah.
The Rambam went through the whole process to reinstate Smicha. So how come Neturei Israel hasn't been everything? Maybe it's more unified right now.
Yeah. So again, I hate to say it, but every single rabbi in this yeshiva and in the world is a faker. None of us are rabbis because none of us have ordination. We don't have smicha. What do you mean you don't have smicha? I can show you a piece of paper, etc. So the answer is that original real smicha is unbroken ordination going back from Moshe Rabbeinu, which involved literally a laying of the hands, a conferral of spiritual authority. At some time during the Roman persecutions, the last people who had smicha were killed before they could ordain their successors. And as a result, we have not had real smicha for almost 2,000 years. Now, what do you need real smicha for? Well, the truth of the matter is, to paskin and to teach Torah, you don't need to have real smicha. But in order to have a Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin of 71, you have to have smicha. Without smicha, we cannot have a Sanhedrin. So we're limited in what we can do. We can't make takanos, we can't make gezeros, etc. So the Rambam was machadesh, the following idea. So how are we going to get, well, before I get to the Rambam, so if we've lost smicha because nobody that had smicha ordained a new generation, then how are we ever going to get it back? How will smicha be re-established? The simple answer is, when Machiach comes, the one who will announce the coming of Machiach will be Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi has smicha. He will be able to ordain Talmidei Chachamim, who will then be able to be on the Sanhedrin, right? So the simple idea is, we're stuck. There's no possibility of smicha today, but we will have Eliyahu Hanavi restore smicha. That's the conventional understanding. The Rambam was mechadesh that there is a way that we could create Smicha even today. Yesh mi'ayin, something out of nothing. And that is, if all of the Chachamim of Am Yisrael, he does use the word all, if all of the Chachamim would come together and say, we want to ordain a certain individual, they would be able to create the authority of ordaining, and that once you have one person who has Smicha, he could give it to other people even without the agreement of the sages of Israel. So this was called Chidush HaSmicha. Now, in truth, this is a very famous episode in Jewish halachic history. In the time of, right before Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Yosef Karo's Rebbe was Rav Yaakov Beirav. And Rav Yaakov Beirav, well, obviously if he was Rav Yosef Karo's Rebbe, he was a great gadol himself, wanted to actually follow this Rambam, and he ordained, he assembled all of the Chachmei Tzfat, which were the majority of the sages in Eretz Yisrael at the time, and he ordained 4 Talmidim. One was Rav Yosef Karo, got Smicha, the Mabit, the Alshich, I think Rav Moshe Galanti. There were 4 Talmidim. And it's very, very clear that this had a messianic agenda in the sense that Rav Yaakov Beirav felt that we needed a Sanhedrin to bring Mashiach, that by being Machadei Smicha, that would be a huge step towards the Biat HaMashiach. The problem was the Chachmei Yerushalayim did not agree. So part of that is a machlokas. When the Rambam says all the Chachamim have to agree, does it mean all, or does it mean a majority? Meaning, does a single Chacham have a veto power on this? Well, some said, yeah, if one person doesn't want to go with it. And so that's one issue. So one issue is, how do you ever get unanimous consent of all the Chachamim? The second issue is, who are the Chachamim that you're counting? So because of this, it petered out. It only went to that first generation, and some say there was a second generation. But beyond that second generation, it was just agreed we weren't going to do it. So people still talk about it. People still talk about it even today, about Chidush HaSmicha. Allegedly, there have been some individuals who claim to have gotten Smicha through this process. But I think that's absolutely impossible, because the one thing I can tell you for sure is you didn't have a majority of Chachmei Yisrael agreeing to confer it. So I would have to say that it's part of the history of halacha, but it's not going to be implemented till Mashiach comes. Okay? Again, the thing is called Chidush HaSmicha. You could probably even get a Wikipedia article on it. Yeah.
We have a famous story that the Rambam brings about a person they married on a boat, and you're okay with it, as an example to the pinnacle of moral development and proper humility. When it comes to other people wronging us, and we're the only person being wronged, and that no one else is being harmed but us, do we always aspire to live by the example of extreme humility that the Rambam brings? Was there ever a time when we adopt a sort of more feisty, go-to-hell attitude? When we're being wronged, is there ever a time when it's okay to fight back, or are we just supposed to sit there and just quote-unquote take it? Even if we may be allowed to talk back, is it always praiseworthy to sit back and take it? And, yeah.
Yeah, this is a very good question just for people who may not know the story. This is a famous story that the Rambam brings. It's based on something in the Chovas HaLevavos, where a chassid, a very pious person, said, the happiest day of my life was, I was once traveling on a boat, and because I was poor, I was thrown into the steerage section, and they used to dump chamber pots, human excrement, and people would urinate there. And because I was just there, I was urinated upon, and it didn't bother me. And I was so happy that I had reached the level that I am not affected by whatever happens to me. And that was a cause of great simcha. So the Rambam is using this as an example of what true humility is, that no matter what happens to you, you don't get affected. So the question was raised, well, gee, is that the way I should behave? Never stand up for myself, always be a dish rag, allow myself to be humiliated without ever asserting myself. So I think you have to understand something, that in truth, what is being described in the Rambam story is not so much humility. What is being described is equanimity. Now, be sure you understand this. Equanimity is a little different than humility. Equanimity means I am not affected by what people do to me. That can actually come from a very deep sense of security. Meaning, when they insult me, I don't let it get to me. And when they praise me, I don't let it swell my head. There's equanimity is the notion that I do what I got to do, and I'm not affected, right? Like the way most of us are, we have different levels of insecurity, is when we're complimented, we feel so great. And when we're insulted or slighted, or we imagine we're insulted or slighted, even if we're not, like we're devastated, we can't go on. Equanimity says, I'm not affected. And it actually takes a very strong sense of security that you're not affected by either the cheers or the jeers. So what I would say is the following. If you're not a person who has reached that level of security, if you're a person that's going to be crushed and despondent, the Torah doesn't want you to remain in a sense of sadness, despair, worthlessness. Meaning, let's imagine it would happen to you, this Smicha. And you would say, I am so humiliated, but because of this story, I'm not going to speak up. You might be missing the point of the story. The point of the story is you train yourself so it doesn't bother you. If it bothers you, then you need to fix it in one way or the other. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it's not about humility, it's about equanimity. And so you train yourself gradually. This is an extreme case. I mean, most people will never reach that much rate. But you train yourself that you're kind of oriented to your task. In fact, Rabbi Akiva once said about even humility this way. What's the definition of humility? So he said, humility is you don't think about yourself as great, but it also means you don't think about yourself as inferior. Humility is you're just not thinking about yourself. In other words, you're focused on the job. You're focused on the task. You're not focused about what does it say about me. You see, a Baal Gaiva and an insecure person have a lot in common because everything becomes a referendum about them. The Baal Gaiva, everything that happens says how great I am. And the guy that lacks self-esteem, every single experience says how, what a wimp I am. But the tzad hashava is, it's about me. I'm great or I'm nothing. Rebbe Akiva says the true midah of anava is you don't really connect everything back to you. You just do. You do the job. Which means when you do good things, you're happy. But you're happy not because you did it. You're happy because something good was done. And that means I'm happy when I do a mitzvah, and I'm happy when you do a mitzvah. Because Baruch Hashem, there's more goodness in the world. You see what I'm saying? So I think a person does have to stand up for himself if he's getting psychologically crushed. It's like a medical procedure, right? If your leg is being crushed, you got to go to a hospital. If you're being psychologically crushed, you got to be able to preserve your mental equilibrium. But the Rambam is referring to a certain level of spiritual development where your mental equilibrium is not being affected. And that's a very high madrega, but until you're there, you need to take steps to stay alive. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. Yeah.
So how would that work in regards to other people? Meaning this is about focusing on yourself. But how should you react to people that actually treat you bad? Should you ignore them? Or should you still view them in a good light try to forgive them.
So there are two things. Every 3 times a day in the Shemona Esrei, L'kai Nitzur, what do we say? Nafshi ki afar, may my soul be like dust. Meaning, I try to train myself not to get upset, not to get angry. At a very, very high level, you try to ask yourself, is there any, this is a real hard one, is there any legitimacy to what they're saying? Let's say people insult you. And they're wrong, and they're rude, and they're saying all sorts of bad things. Okay, they're wrong. The question is, but is there something in what they said that maybe can apply to me? This is a real high level. But then I try to take it. And then I can actually look at them as messengers from Hashem to give me some message, albeit in a harsh way. So that's one aspect of it. Take the musar, if it applies. Another aspect of it is try to judge them favorably, meaning even if they're wrong, this is what Talmud Devorah talks about. Try to judge them favorably by saying, they had a bad day, they're under stress, etc. And don't get consumed with it, because if you get consumed with it, that's going to destroy you inside. So I would say that the 3 responses are, take the musar, judge people favorably, and try to cultivate an equanimity where you don't take it as such a personal attack. A lot of times when people attack you, putting aside the musar that might be true, it's much more about what they're going through than what you're going through. Okay? Something's going on in their life that's making them act that way. And as the Talmud Devorah says, once you look at it that way, you can actually have rachmanis for them, because, they must be going through a real bad time in their life to behave like such a rotten person. And you train yourself, because as I say, when you're at the mercy of other people, you don't have shlita over your life. Their compliments swell your head, their insults break your spirit. You're like a yo-yo. You're like totally at the mercy of what other people do. Equanimity basically says, my only master is Hashem, and vis-a-vis the rest of the human race, I'm kind of free. I'm not going to allow them to affect me. Again, I'm a little embarrassed because I'm speaking about very, very high levels. I am very, very far from reaching those madrigas, so it's always a little embarrassing for me. But these are the things that are being talked about in the Rambam story there. Don't get affected by people. Don't let them affect you. You do what's right. If they bring up a point that may have some legitimacy, then take the point, even if they exaggerated it and distorted it, but there may be a kernel of truth. And other than that, go on. Yeah.
Imagine in an example, like a Sephardi restaurant, you like those cuts of meat that they have like here in Israel, they don't have in America, like the near the good
Yes. B'derech klal, an Ashkenazi can eat in a Sephardi restaurant with proper hashkafa, even if they do niker, even if they do the removal of the gid anasha, which Ashkenazim do not do. Where you actually do have a problem is you do have a problem for a Sephardi eating in an Ashkenazi restaurant. And the main problem is bishul akum. Let me just explain this, because this is actually a major difference that can be very, 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 very significant. This is a rabbinic law. The rabbinic law is that even if a food is 100% kosher, if it was cooked by a non-Jew, so rabbinically you're not allowed to eat it, but this doesn't apply to all food. It only applies to some food. It does not apply to any food that could have been eaten raw. So for example, if a guy bakes an apple, you can eat the baked apple because apples can be eaten raw. And the second condition, which is tricky, is it only applies to fancy food that would be served at a royal banquet. So it would apply to roast beef, it wouldn't apply to oatmeal, or it wouldn't apply to scrambled eggs, breakfast foods, or the like. But Bishul Akum is a real concern. Now, here is the difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. According to the Ramaz Psak, if an Ashkenazi had any, if a Jew had any role whatsoever in the cooking process, he turned on the oven, or he threw a piece of wood on the fire. Even if the guy did 99% of the cooking, that's not Bishul Akum anymore, and the Jew could eat it. If, according to Sephardim, the Jew has to be much more involved in the cooking process. Now, I will tell you that in many kosher restaurants that employ, particularly in Chutz La'aretz, that employ non-Jewish cooks, right? Most kosher restaurants have usually staffs that at least some of the cooks are not Jewish. So the mashgiach every morning turns on the oven, but he's not involved in any of the cooking. So for an Ashkenazi, that is not Bishul Akum. For a Sephardi, it would be. So a Sephardi would have to investigate, talk to the mashgiach, whether there's a Bishul Akum problem for Sephardim. So to answer your direct question, there is much less of a problem for an Ashkenazi to eat in a Sephardi restaurant than there is for a Sephardi to eat in an Ashkenazi restaurant. So that you'd have to figure out. Yeah.
Could Sephardim be molded to a psak if they're in an Ashkenazi yeshiva?
Can they do what?
If Sephardim are in an Ashkenazi, that's Ohr Somayach is an Ashkenazi yeshiva.
Yeah.
Let's say Ohr Somayach, I'm not sure what they do. If they employ a non-Jewish chef, can Sephardim rely on the psak of their yeshiva and?
No, they could not. I mean, unless they want to become Ashkenazi, but assuming they're still following Sefardi Halachah, the fact that they're in an Ashkenazi yeshiva would not take away the Bishul Akum problem. But as I say, as far as I know, Ohr Somayach does not, we don't use any non-Jewish cooking staff, so we don't have that problem. Most yeshivas do not, but certainly restaurants in New York, if you go into any restaurant, kosher restaurant kitchen in New York, you'll have Puerto Ricans and Chinese, and all sorts of different ethnic groups. Many cooks in kosher restaurants are not Jewish. Yeah.
What din of reshut does a large man-made canal have?
I'm sorry, say it again. What
din of reshut does a large man-made canal have?
In other words, what level of reshut is a large man-made canal? It's a little tricky. You're talking about there's water in the canal? Yeah. So generally speaking, even if it's very wide, it would have the status of a carmelis. It would not be a reshus harabim. Again, under Torah law, you're not allowed to carry from what's called a private reshus to a reshus harabim, but reshus harabim has many specific definitions, and things like even oceans and Kal v'chomer large canals are generally going to be carmelis. So the carrying restrictions are rabbinic. They're not going to be Torah law under those circumstances. Yeah. Why does the Torah not go in chronological order? Yeah, very good question, right? Ein mukta mucha b'Torah. The Torah does not always go in chronological order. That's a fact, but you still got to explain, okay, if it's not chronological, then what is it for? What is it doing? So the answer would have to be, there's not a single answer, meaning in any given case, you have to ask the question, what is the Torah trying to teach by giving this incident out of order? And it's not always going to be the same answer. So my answer to your question is, why is the Torah sometimes not in chronological order? Because there are lessons it is trying to convey by juxtaposing two events together, even though it's not in the sequence in which they occurred. And then you're going to have to darshan what that reason would be in every given case. Yeah.
Why would Hashem make Torah about that? Why wouldn't he just write it all down?
Yeah, so the question is, why does God make an oral law at all? Why isn't everything written down? So the simplest answer would be because that would be a book that would be as big as libraries. So you can't do it. But there is a deeper reason, and that is the Torah is eternal. The Torah is forever and ever and ever. But life changes. New technologies develop. New situations arise. So the idea of keeping things oral allows what you would call a flexibility, an ability to take Hashem's fixed laws and apply them to new situations. Once something is set down in writing, it kind of gets frozen. It kind of gets set in stone, quite literally. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted there to be a certain dynamism in applying the Torah to ever-changing realities, and that's what the oral law allows us to do. And that steps in.
Certain times the Torah will say to do something, and the Rebbe will say no, like
Shofar and Shabbos, yeah. So what's the? I'm sorry. What's the? Say again? Oh, you're asking about the authority of Chazal to uproot a Torah mitzvah? That is absolutely a big chiddush, right? What is the rule? When Chazal have a concern, they have the power to uproot a Torah commandment if they do it passively and not actively, meaning they couldn't tell you eat treif, but they can tell you don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos because we are afraid you might carry and the like. So this is very extraordinary. Chazal have the koach to uproot a commandment of Hashem. So the question is, where do they get that koach? How can they uproot what Hashem commanded? So the answer is, this is a koach, the Rambam writes, that is given to them by the Torah. When the Torah says, you shall not, lo sasur, you shall not depart from what they tell you, this is a Torah giving Chazal the koach to make such gezeirah. Meaning, you're 100% right. If the Torah wouldn't have given Chazal the koach, they wouldn't have been allowed to do it. The Torah allows them to do it. Quite an amazing thing. And by the way, you can't give me an answer. Well, we never really lose shofar because we always have the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Well, not really. The second day of Rosh Hashanah, blowing shofar is midrabanan. It's not deraisa. So when they take away the first day, we are actually losing the mitzvah deraisa. Okay, last question. Yeah. Next to last question. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. When a person is davening for a shidduch,
yeah,
should he have like a shopping list of things that he wants, or should he daven for Hashem to send his zivug?
I think the idea of a shopping list is not so great because a lot of times you'll find that what you think you want is maybe not what's good for you. I think you ask Hashem, send me the shidduch that is right for me. Now, in your hishtadlus, you need to ask yourself what you're looking for. In other words, you have to think, what are the qualities that I want to see in a partner? But in terms of the nusach of tefillah, I don't think your nusach should be that specific. I think your nusach should give me the shidduch that I need, that is good for me. And Hashem will take into account your hishtadlus in terms of what you've identified as what you need. But it's not good to be too specific. Leave it to Hashem to kind of decide what is the best thing for you. Do you have one more question?
Yeah. What are the two opposing schools of thought on astrology and its practical use and its metaphysical?
Yeah. This is a question that's much longer than we can talk about it now. Let me just say that B'kitzer, the Rambam himself considered astrology to be totally fake, to be inauthentic, to be garbage, and he dismisses it legamre. On the other hand, there is absolutely no question that there were great Rishonim who considered astrology to be a very, very serious idea, that one of the ways God runs the world is through powers that are channeled through stars and planets. The Ibn Ezra wrote, besides his Perushim on Chumash and on Anach, he wrote no fewer than 10 books on astrology. And they're absolute. Now, keep in mind, the astrology of the Rishonim or even Chazal is not the same as, the astrology in a horoscope. So there actually is a new book that came out relatively recently. I think it's called Kosher Astrology. And obviously, according to the Rambam, that's an oxymoron. There is no such thing as kosher astrology. But this is a book that's based on the Ibn Ezra, the Zohar, the Kabbalists believed in it. So obviously I can't paskin here, but I can say that the truth of the matter is there are more views not like the Rambam than the Rambam itself. It seems that there was a kayach, or there is a kayach of the Kochavim, but remember that that's balanced with another fundamental principle called Ein Mazal Yisrael, and that is that even though Kochavim, Mazalais kind of run the world, but a Jew can have a relationship with God that takes him above and beyond that Mazal. So it's never a predetermined type of thing. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say like the Kutzker that after the Rambam, Paskin
Very good, very good. Just like the Rambam said, the Kutzker said by Shadim, once the Rambam paskins, there are no Shadim, they disappear. So maybe the planets lose their koach. Good horror. I don't know what the Kutzker would say about that, but you might be right. Yeah, last question.
Is one allowed to pet a hypoallergenic dog? I mean, one that doesn't shed for often?
You talking about on Shabbos?
Yeah,
Yeah. So keep in mind that there are two problems with petting animals. One is the problem of the hair shedding, and that would not be there in your case. But there's another issue that the Gemara tells us, and the Shulchan Aruch so paskins, that Balei Chayim, all animals, are muktzah. You're not supposed to move them on Shabbos. Now, if they are muktzah, so the question is petting, which is a back and forth motion, is that treated like movement? Now, there's a big machlokas going back to the Rishonim, whether the muktzah of Chazal for Balei Chayim applies to recreational pets. Chazal were actually talking about work animals, like horses, donkeys, and the like. And there are shitas in the Rishonim that allow recreational pets to be moved because they're like toys. However, the Shulchan Aruch does not paskin that way. So the Shulchan Aruch would apparently have a din of muktzah and recreational pets. So it is a machlokas haposkim. Rav Moshe in an earlier tshuva simply restated the conventional halacha that recreational pets are muktzah on Shabbos, but in a much later tshuva that people sometimes call into question about authenticity, written towards the very end of his life, he actually said you could be somech l'kula that recreational pets are in fact not muktzah. So according to that last psak, not only could you pet the dog, you could even move the dog. You could even carry the dog. But as I say, it is a big machlokas. If you look in halachic books, like the English art scroll halachic books, you'll actually see contradictions. I think most of the books will say, not allowed to move pets. But Rav Moshe Lemaisa has a tshuva that you are allowed to. So what I tell people is, I kind of have a compromise, meaning I think you should be machmir not to move the pet by carrying it, but I think you could be makel to pet the animal, because even if there's a din of muktzah, the back and forth motion of petting might not be considered movement. So I think if you combine the heter of pets not being muktzah with the fact that petting is not considered, or might not be considered movement, you could be makel in that way. Okay, last question.
Yeah, so my Rebbe back home has been, very nicely introduced to black cat, and I don't, and it's kind of been like an enigma for me. I don't actually understand it. I don't have the positive or negative to say about it. I don't understand.
Yeah. The center actually has rules. When Rav Wiener used to be head of the center, now he's promotion upstairs, but he actually had a rule that you weren't allowed to wear a black hat for a year or something. Yeah, there were rules about not to rush too fast. Okay, so there are two aspects with the black hat. One is the halachic role of it, and the other is the sociological, institutional role of it, which frankly may not be that important, but in many places that became important. The notion of wearing a black hat, actually it doesn't have to be black, wearing a hat, let's say, wearing a hat for davening was based on the idea that, number one, maybe the conventional yarmulke is not good enough for tefillah. For tefillah, you need to cover all of your head. Number two, it's also based on a zohar that said you should have two head coverings, so the kippah and something above the kippah. although many say the lining of a kippah is 2 head coverings. And number 3, that since when you daven, you should feel that you're standing before a king. So it used to be, now less so today, that when you go to visit a king, you would put on a hat. It was part of a formal dress code. So based on that, for those 3 reasons, covering your whole head, double cover, and omed b'fnei hamelech, it became customary among particularly Eastern European Jews that when you daven, you would put on a hat or a cap. What has happened is that became transposed to the U.S. and to Eretz Yisrael and other countries as well. So originally, it had something to do with the appropriate dress for davening, which would mean, in other words, that even if you wear a black hat, there's absolutely no reason why you should wear it in the street. At most, it's a davening rule. Okay. What has happened, though, is that just like black and white generally, the hat has become part of the uniform. Just like, what are those gangs in L.A., the Crits and the... Crits and the what? The Bloods, right? You got to wear the right uniform. You're not wearing the right uniform, you can get stabbed or whatever. So it turns out that the Haredi world, the Haredi yeshiva world, has uniforms. Should we have uniforms? Do we need to have uniforms? We could argue about that. And ultimately, it's not that important. In my opinion, it's not that important, but okay. But the black hat has become part of a uniform. Now, uniforms have a psychological function, because when you wear the uniform, you identify more strongly with the group. So indirectly, I think what your Rebbe might be saying is, wearing a hat makes me identify on a more emotional level with my group, which can have a lot of benefits. So it's not that it's intrinsically that important, but it's become important, and therefore it becomes significant as an identifier, okay? Which means, you can write a whole book on this. There probably is a book on it. This is the sociology of Hareidism, meaning, Hareidi should be based on halachos and everything, but there's also a sociology. There is a cultural aspect, and that has some role, because that creates group identification, which is sometimes important in building a community. Okay, but I will tell you that Rabbi Wiener, other people, Rabbis in Ohr Somayach, they do not encourage Talmidim to wear hats right away, maybe only on Shabbos or the like, because they don't want people to move too quickly. They say you have to move at a reasoned pace where everything makes sense to you. Don't try to jump. Like, we've had guys here who, they came in on Monday in tank tops, shorts, and a ponytail. And on Tuesday, they have a shaved head, payas, and kapata. And Mama's like a day later, what happened? Problem is, you go from ponytail on Monday to payas on Tuesday. On Wednesday, somehow you'll go back to I guess you can't get a ponytail in one day, but, easy come, easy go. Meaning, you make those changes really, really quickly. You can also drop them and become worse off than you started. So it's good to kind of be slower in these changes than faster. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.